After reading the comments on some of my videos, it seems like people are still talking about the best strategies for beating multiple opponents. I kind of thought the martial arts community had passed this, but I guess not. The reality is that successfully fighting groups of people is virtually impossible, and I want everyone to stop pretending they can do it. I'm going to delve into the arguments about what you should do against multiple attackers, explain why it's way harder than people think it is, and explain what you need to do to actually stand a chance. One of the most common pieces of advice you'll hear is to avoid grappling, which is silly because avoiding grappling in its entirety is impossible. If someone shoots for my legs and I masterfully down block, sprawl, circle, and get separation, what did I just spend 3 to 4 seconds doing? Grappling. Getting separation that quickly requires a large amount of skill, and it was still more than enough time for that guy's friend to close the distance and start landing strikes. And this is assuming that everything goes perfectly, because defending a takedown usually takes a lot longer. You don't simply get to decide where the fight takes place. Stopping a takedown from one person is hard enough. If a gang of people decide you're going to the ground, you're going to the ground. Takedown defense is a skill, not a force field. Furthermore, telling people to avoid grappling implies that striking multiple people is somehow possible. It's not. The only way you're going to pull that off is by landing several quick knockouts in a row. That's been done, but it requires God-given power, a ton of luck, and a group of opponents that are all incompetent. It can happen, but if that's your plan, you're stupid. But don't worry, people have come up with a solution. Just use footwork to keep them stacked in a line so you only fight one at a time.
So when moving against a group, what I want to be able to do is create a line.
So let's say you're fighting 2 people and they're already in a line, and then they hit you with a pincer maneuver. What are you going to do? Just hop over to the outside? Can you teleport? No, you're going to move towards the outside and then they're going to adjust. Without superhuman speed, your ability to keep your opponent stacked relies on them making a constant stream of mistakes. But oh wait, people have solved that problem too! Just clinch up with one person and then maneuver them in between you and the other opponent.
So with a simple movement, I can put in between myself and Noah.
The problem is, number 1, it requires you reposition someone that's actively fighting you faster than someone can run. Number 2, there's no guarantee that the second attacker can't just reach over their friend to hit you.
The puncher is always going to throw hesitant and tentative punches the whole time he's punching over his buddy's back.
Would you bet your life on that? These guys pick to fight and have plenty of confidence from outnumbering you. Assuming they're unable to commit to a punch might be the last mistake you make. Number 3, with your arms controlling your first opponent and your legs trying to constantly outmaneuver the second opponent, how are you actually going to finish off the first opponent? Your only option is knee strikes while maneuvering, which risks you being taken down. Number 4, now you're locked in a clinch with someone. All that theorizing, and where did it lead you? Back to grappling. It works pretty well when the guy in the clinch offers absolutely no resistance and the other guy refuses to commit to a punch, but I don't know if reality is going to work that way. Any small mistake in your maneuvering strategy can fall apart in an instant. Note that all of these strategies are hard enough against 2 people. Now imagine how incredibly difficult it would be against 3 or 4. How on God's green earth do you keep this person between you and both of these people when these people do this? Are you going to outcircle 2 people while dragging a third with you? You might be able to argue that some people are stupid and won't have the strategic presence of mind to understand the importance of outmaneuvering you and committing to their attack. While that is entirely possible, any plan that relies on the enemy being completely incompetent is a bad plan. Anyone that has 2 brain cells to rub together can probably figure out go around the side. Okay, so if all the current theories won't work, why is fighting multiple attackers so difficult? Great question. The answer is surprisingly complicated, but it's also the most important point of this whole video. Now let's do everyone's favorite activity, math. The way people typically think about multiple attackers is that fighting 2 attackers is twice as hard as 1 attacker, and 3 attackers is 3 times as hard as 1 attacker. This can be represented by the equation D equals P times N, where P is the average power level of your opponents, N is the total number of opponents you're fighting, and D is the difficulty of the fight. D can also be thought of as what your power level needs to be in order to have a 50-50 chance of winning the fight. This equation seems intuitive, but it's entirely wrong. The equation you should be using is D equals P times N squared. This means that the difficulty of the fight goes up exponentially as the number of opponents increases, not linearly. So fighting 2 opponents is 4 times harder than fighting 1 opponent, and fighting 3 opponents is 9 times harder. This is known as the square law of multiple attackers, and it's the most important point to understand in this discussion. You may be thinking that the fight can't possibly be that hard, but I can prove it. Fights, power levels, and difficulties are hard to quantify, so I'm going to use the example of a video game boss fight to make things easier to visualize. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume we have a very basic video game. You and the enemy stand in front of each other and deal perfectly constant rates of damage with no misses. Now assume that winning the boss fight causes you to lose 50% of your health. Because you drained all of their health while only losing half of yours, you're twice as good as them. Now imagine that we double the boss's health points. It will now take you twice as long to kill them, which means they stay in the fight for twice as long and are able to deal twice the damage. The fight is now perfectly even, which means doubling their health points made them twice as strong. That makes sense. Now imagine the boss has their original amount of health points, but there are now 2 of them. This means that they'll deal damage at twice the rate, and there are twice the number of targets. If you're able to focus all of your firepower on one boss, which is the ideal strategy, then you'll be able to kill that boss at roughly the same time you die. Instead of winning the boss fight and only losing half your health, you've now only beaten one of the 2 bosses and lost all of your health. Mathematically, fighting 2 bosses is 4 times as hard as fighting 1 boss. And if you do the math, you'll find that fighting 3 bosses is 9 times as hard. A quick side note for the nerds out there. I know you want to argue that if the fight were able to continue, one of the bosses is now dead, which halves the firepower and therefore makes the fight only 3 times as hard as fighting 1 boss instead of 4 times. And I acknowledge that you're technically correct, but this example ignores the complexities of maneuvering, dodging multiple attacks, and assumes that you can focus all of your firepower on one opponent the entire fight. The square law is probably closer to reality. Plus, none of that matters because the fight doesn't get to continue because you're massively outgunned. That's the point. Once we understand the square law of multiple attackers, we start to grasp why fighting groups of people is so difficult. You're dealing with multiple attacks coming from multiple targets at multiple angles. In that kind of scenario, your defenses can get quickly overwhelmed, and generating any sort of sustained offense is all but impossible. When people say that grappling can't handle multiple attackers, they are technically correct, but only because there's absolutely no martial art that can handle multiple attackers. The only decent strategies are running away, yelling for help, begging for mercy, or pulling an absolutely game-changing weapon. Running away is likely the best plan because groups of people don't run any faster than a single person. If you fight a dozen people, you have to outfight all of them combined, which is virtually impossible. If you run away from a half dozen people, you only have to be faster than each of them individually, which is a lot more feasible. Using your hands to fight them off requires a ton of luck or a very significant tactical advantage like a narrow hallway forcing them to stay lined up. Trying to pick a strategy to fight multiple people is like trying to pick which rifle you want to fight off an enemy battalion. Either you're in a gloriously fortified position with God on your side, or you're just fooling yourself. And yeah, you can find stories and videos with one guy knocking out 3 or 4 attackers, but that's luck. People win the lottery all the time, but you're not going to win the lottery. And planning to win the lottery is stupid. The only way you're going to reliably win this kind of lopsided fight is if your opponents are weak, cowardly idiots. But any group of reasonably sized adults with more than 1 brain cell between them is going to stomp you into the dirt. That's reality. I'm sorry.